Hello, Psych 101, Sections 5 and 6, Spring 2020, Lincoln University of Missouri, Dr. Johnson's Intro Psych sections. I'm recording this for us on Saturday morning, March 28th, 2020 at 9:40 a.m. I have had a pretty steep learning curve with this technology in terms of getting the voiceovers to the PowerPoints done. I spent several hours yesterday afternoon trying to get this to work, and I don't know why they didn't work out. So I'm giving this another try this morning. I've done some test run-throughs. I'm going to be making these shorter, partly because of the frustration of not knowing why it was that the two sessions that I did yesterday uh, didn't turn out, and it takes a long time to do them. So this particular lecture is going to be a recap of the intro to the five-factor model. Just 4 slides that kind of give the bullet points, the highlights of the things that we were talking about in the first lecture. Before we do that, I wanted to show you a couple of things, and I'm looking away from the screen to you because I've got a second screen. I posted this set of slides, which is a continuation of, it's actually a duplicate to some degree of this set, which we looked at in the first lecture. I took the slides from the first lecture out and added these recap slides and then tuned up the rest of them in terms of talking about about the specific factors and facets. I added this document so you can look at the normal distribution as you're thinking about scores on a large screen if you like. I added this after the first lecture when we were talking about the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. And then this is a link to an example of the printout descriptions that any of you got if you did the IP Neo quiz online, and it's for somebody else's results, but it reminds you how the factors and facets were described. Okay, let's go to our recap. I kept as the first slide this slide that's got the the picture of the normal curve, which is a smaller version of this Word document that you can open. And we're going to come back to this in just a second. So in the first lecture, we described the five-factor model as not being exactly a theory of personality, because by itself it doesn't offer any explanations of where the observed differences come from. And that's really what you want in a theory. You want a theory to explain things. And the five-factor model at this point is still mostly a descriptive model, but because good description can give us good prediction, it's still worth paying attention to. Even though the five-factor model is not exactly a theory, there was and is a theory behind the logic of putting together, and that's lexical theory. Lexical meaning having to do with words. And so the whole idea behind the lexical theory is we can go to the dictionary, we can find all the words that are in the dictionary to describe differences between people, and those words are there for a reason. They actually have information value about describing how people are different from each other in different kinds of situations. Some ways of constructing measures of psychological constructs want you to understand what the construct is clearly before you begin to put the measure together. And the way that the five-factor model came to be wasn't actually put together that way. We took all the words in the dictionary. We asked people to make us a data set by saying how much these words apply to you, how much they apply to other people that you know well, and then we fed all those responses in that data set into our factor analysis and let the factor analysis sort them out, and we ended up with the 5 big factors. So it's very empirical, but it didn't have a theory to begin with, other than the fact that, like, these words probably mean something. Let's sort out what they mean. In terms of sort of like functional usefulness of the 5-factor theory, the 5-factor model, it's hard for me to stop saying 5-factor theory, even though when I'm telling you it's not a theory, it's a model. They describe in general 5 separate ways that people are predictable and consistent in their functional interactions with others. That is, are we easy or difficult to get along with? And are we easy or difficult to please or annoy? So the 5-factor model is one approach to personality. We talked about 3 sort of big psychological constructs that psychology has been devoting a lot of energy and work to measuring and figuring out exactly what the measures mean. The first 2, the historic ones, were intelligence, which most broadly is how quickly and easily individuals learn new things and apply those new things, and personality, how individuals are consistently different from each other across time and situations in terms of how they react to the environment. And then we talked about a third broad psychological construct that has received a lot of attention during the last half of the 20th century is aptitude, which refers to skills and abilities that we have already acquired, developed, and we can continue to improve on. And we talked about how the fact that in terms of actually aptitude is related to intelligence, but it's not exactly the same thing. And in many ways, it's probably aptitude scores are probably better predictors of specific kinds of success than intelligence scores are, at least in terms of career and work kinds of success. So, here's the other thing that is actually kind of a higher order point, but I'm asking you to think about it. Psychological individual difference constructs, including personality, intelligence, and aptitude, and then anything more specific that we might come up with, and psychologists have come up with hundreds of specific individual difference measurements to research a variety of different kinds of responses and behaviors. Almost all of our psychological individual difference constructs are measured relatively. That means we compare an individual against group means. Also, always keep in mind when we're measuring anything, but because the measurement of psychological constructs is relative, comparing an individual against a group, as opposed to absolute, for instance, height or weight, it's very important for psychological variables to keep in mind when we're talking about the measurement of psychological variables that there is always error. We never get an exactly 100% accurate measurement of these variables. We get a best approximation of them. When we're talking about psychological constructs, individual difference constructs are measured on the normal distribution. Scores on a normally distributed measurement give us information about how to compare individual scores against the number of people out of 100 who also took the test. This is the thing that I didn't really highlight so much in the first two recordings, but in this recap I wanted to come back and talk about, like, okay, when you're looking at your percentile score on any of the IP-Neo factor or facet scores, you're thinking about it in terms of how do I compare on my score versus all of the other people who have taken this test and have become part of what we call the normative sample. On the IP-Neo, in terms of the fact that Dr. Johnson, not this Dr. Johnson, but the Dr. Johnson who runs that site, has had that up for 15 or more years, he's got a very large data set. So you're not actually talking about just 100 people who've taken the test, but probably tens of thousands. But in terms of like interpreting scores, the easy way to think about it is how to compare your individual score against any random 100 other people who might have taken the test. The most important way to think about average scores, and when we're talking about individual different scores, is to focus on the 50% of scores around the mean rather than the 50% above or the 50% below. And when we're interpreting our scores that are A, normally distributed, and B, reported on percentile scores, the most unique, the most telling scores, the ones that are going to show where you are most unlike the rest of the people who've taken the test, are scores above 72 and lower than 28. So let's go back to our up close normal distribution and talk some about what we meant, what the last two slides meant in terms of interpreting scores on a normally distributed set of scores. Let's say that your score on the big extroversion factor came back as 30. So here's our percentile scores, 1 through 99, and your score on extroversion is 30. What that means is that for every 100 random people who take the test, you score higher than 30 of those 100 people, and 70 of those 100 people score higher than you. So one of the things that's sort of interesting about having looked at several years worth of people's scores and reports is that for Lincoln students who have taken this test as part of one of my classes, they've ended up with scores on all 5 factors that go from 1 to 99. So it's not particularly unusual. It's just that the higher or lower score, for anybody to get any one score, it's just that means like, oh, well, if you compare yourself to like 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people or 100,000 people, if you got a really low score, most people report higher endorsement of those behaviors and feelings than you did. And if you've got a really high score, like around 99, it's like you're endorsing that, yeah, these behaviors and these feelings and these responses apply to me. more than most people. Um, Going back to the idea that the most important percent is the 50% in the middle. Is, okay, and let's go back to the idea that somebody has received an individual score of 30 on the extroversion facet. So here's the line. It's not quite here's one whole standard deviation below the mean. Here's one whole standard deviation above the mean. This score 28 is the lowest score, and this score 72 is the highest score, and in between those two scores are the scores for 50%, half of the people who have taken this test at one time or another. Those are the sort of range of average. Now, I actually think that if you get out towards about 30 or 70, you're probably beginning to be noticeably a little bit different in terms of your standard or average responses to situations and people. But in terms of the way the statistics end up, it's the 25% with the particularly low scores and the 25% with the particularly high scores who are really going to be noticeably different than everybody else. Okay, so that's the recap. That's sort of the summary, the short version of the first lecture, which was posted as 2 screencast-o-matic presentations. We're going to wrap this one up, and then we'll come back and we'll do the discussion of the meaning of the 5 factors.